Environmental humanities is a rapidly growing field of interdisciplinary work that addresses ecology, the environment, and culture in various contexts and media. Drawing on the arts, literature, performance, music, history, and other modes of cultural expression, the environmental humanities emphasizes imagination and human relationships as key elements of ecological understanding in the past, present, and most importantly, future.
The environmental humanities is a cultural way of approaching environmental problems. Environmental problems are not just scientific or related to public policy. They relate to the imagination and the way ordinary people perceive their world. And that requires approaching them not just through science and policy, but through art and literature and other public media forms.
For me, I think I define the environmental humanities as the intersection between environmental science, or the natural sciences, and then arts and humanities disciplines.
Environmental humanities be any study of the environment, natural world that incorporates some of the methodologies of the humanities. So that's things like critical thinking, speculative thinking, also some of the more creative arts. Environmental humanities as a field asks us to think about the fact that humans, as part of the environment, are animals that think speculatively, that are subjective, and that are creative. And so some of the those aspects of our thought and our actions can both help us to address environmental issues, but are also just part of our environment more generally.
As I see it, the separation of the arts and sciences is actually a fairly recent modern phenomenon that emerged in the 20th century as education and research became specialized and compartmentalized, especially in universities. And this idea of two cultures developed, where there were the sciences and then the humanities. And ironically, that separation would have looked very strange to people in much of the 19th century and centuries before.
It seems paradoxical that environmental humanities might be a thing because you think of the environment as being the environment without humans, and then you think of the humanities as being very anthropocentric. And so how can you reconcile the environment, which in our minds is supposed to be basically untouched, pristine wilderness, with the humanities, which is research, scholarship, everything that humans do to advance the collective humanity?
It was sort of surprising to my advisors that I wanted to look at science or scientific issues in the literature that I was studying. And on the one hand, they were surprised. On the other hand, they were encouraging because this was kind of new work that hadn't been done. And when I think about that now, even in the last 20 years, it doesn't feel nearly so new. Sometimes I do experience a kind of a skepticism, I would say, towards, well, what is the value of opening up your work or engaging with more of the hard science methodology and content.
So I think it being such a new overlap kind of makes it challenging when you're trying to figure out more. It's also exciting, there's so much more that we can look at through this humanities aspect of environmental science.
I'm a scientist, and so within my science, there's really no room for the humanities because science is just following the scientific method to answer questions. And when I'm doing that, when I'm in that box, I don't really consider the environmental humanities or anything. I'm trying to be completely objective. But before I start to study, I'm thinking about what I want to study and why. And after I do the study, I'm I'm thinking about what to do with that information. And so before and after my scientific method is occurring, I'm thinking a lot about the environmental humanities.
There is indeed a human factor influencing the environmental systems that we like to think of as so, hard and kind of unchangeable. That being said, in order to model those human-environment relationships, you have to understand the human dynamic really at every step of the process, and how what we might think of as subjective or not important is, in fact, shaping the world.
If I just were to do environmental science specifically, I don't think I would have had this much of a passion for like human rights or just kind of motivation for making a big change.
If you're looking at how a scientist can benefit from actually being an environmental humanities person or being influenced by that, or whether a humanities person would benefit from becoming an environmental humanist, I see the obvious benefit of bringing in perspectives that you didn't have in one group or the other, in one area or the other, but also the satisfaction that you get from teaching or studying something in academics is so much greater if your impact is broader.
I am a firm believer that conservation should be rooted in science and facts. But when it comes to strategy and when it comes to implementing solutions that can actually change the world, you have to consider a bunch of different things. You have to consider the cultural, psychological fabric of a community. You have to talk about the visual vocabulary of different places and how those solutions fit in with alternative livelihoods and how it's really going to shape the look of a community. So that's when conservation and art really come into play.
Being able to overlap these two has really pushed me to look at what I want to do in the future, and I'm interested in creating sustainable ideas that are really creative, whether that be through architecture school or even law school, or just becoming an activist and looking for sustainable ways of finding a future. I think that being able to be creative and then also have science has really helped me find that kind of drive.
When you're talking about the environment, you have to talk about people, just because you're always interacting with nature as a person. And a lot of conservation initiatives used to focus on how do we protect these areas? How do we make sure that people aren't using those areas? But that's just impossible, especially when you have over 7 billion people on this planet and not a lot of space, and obviously the population keeps growing. So now I think the more modern approach is how do we make sure that people are able to sustain their livelihoods while also not depleting the natural resources.
If you go from humanities to environmental humanities, or from studying the environment to environmental humanities, you're really broadening out the impact that you can have. You're increasing your impact and you're broadening the number of people in your audience, and also being able to study new things that didn't exist in either field.
The future of our generation and the health depends on environmental well-being, and I love the science part of it, but also art is so important for any sort of society. Being creative is the most human thing I think anybody can do.
Students get it, and fortunately, William & Mary's Environment and Sustainability program also gets it and is now instituting a new environmental humanities track. And so they are even more fully embracing the kind of interdisciplinarity that students are now increasingly taking for granted. So I'm encouraged by what's happening at William & Mary and by the imagination of William & Mary students.
When I took that work into the classroom, I found that often, this was something that I wanted to talk about with my students, and it was something that they were interested in. A lot of students in my classes were themselves trying to understand how environmental issues and social or cultural issues interacted.
People just have that light bulb moment where they're like, oh, that totally makes sense, but I just didn't think about it. Which is cool, because then you're kind of lighting a fire in their brains, igniting a fire and giving them something to think about and maybe look more into, something that they didn't really realize existed or, didn't realize people studied, which I like.
The students at William & Mary today are going to be living in a world that is increasingly marked by environmental problems of vast proportions. Global warming, environmental injustices, global migration exacerbated by global warming and other disruptive factors. And so I think all students need to learn some of the basic terms and issues and ideas that the environmental studies in general have to offer. I'm actually very encouraged by students at William & Mary who find no problem at all thinking about art and ecology, environmental humanities and sciences and policy as logically working together. Environmental humanities is becoming a thing. It's becoming institutionalized as an important kind of subfield within the larger environmental studies. And so I think William & Mary would benefit from participating in that growing nationwide, indeed international conversation about the environmental humanities.
Going into college and knowing what I wanted to do, I was really lost. And if I had had that environmental humanities or like environmental art, environmental music, like that kind of thing, I think it would have really helped me feel more confident in what I was picking. Like when I chose to major in these two things, I was really nervous. I had like a whole day where I had a freak out, like no one's gonna want to hire an art history and environmental science major because it's too widespread. So I think if I had had that overlapping of environmental humanities that encompasses like sociology, activism, art, that would have helped me a lot more feel confident.
When you look at the bottom line, which is just improving ourselves, enlightening ourselves, and trying to be better people and help each other, that's when you really realize that art and environmental science, they marry.
I would say that the environmental humanities not only enriches the interdisciplinary conversation about environmental problem solving, and therefore can benefit scientists and policy people, but it also benefits the humanities by making the humanities more engaged in urgent problems of our time and interdisciplinary thinking in general.
In my mind, those things might not have gone together, but I think it's badly needed, and I think it would provide a very comfortable, inclusive path for people like me who like both worlds and are intimidated by both. It would have been a nice sort of middle ground to pursue that, and hopefully it develops into a discipline, because I'm sure I'm not the only person who feels attracted to those kinds of studies.
Having an umbrella term like environmental humanities, it helps encompass like all the sort of various areas that people might be looking at, and helps sort of bring them together and sort of give it, even if it's not, if it's a new term, something that people can latch on to.
What does language do, right? What does it do to have identifiable, recognizable terminology for a field? Well, it gives it legitimacy, it makes it visible, it allows the people interested in it to form a community, right?
Scientists have been studying climate change for 100 years. We've already known that carbon dioxide increases the temperature by trapping heat. We have learned everything about what exactly is going to happen when we get to various degree points of extra heat in the future. But we haven't made the slightest difference in terms of the climate change crisis. It hasn't worked at all. All this science has not helped at all.
This has been happening for tens of thousands of years, really. There's a huge debate as to when, the Earth system was fundamentally altered because of human activity. And, some geologists say that it's when we started using fire. Some say that it's when agriculture was developed. But I think it's definitely important to take into account that really long-term perspective on how we've been shaping this planet for a lot longer than most people seem to think.
Solving climate change is squarely going to end up being a human problem, and social scientists can help somewhat by looking at politics and how people respond to questions about money and that sort of thing. But I think it's really on the environmental humanities to solve climate change by figuring out what will actually make people care and change. That is something which people in an English department aren't really doing by themselves, and people in a biology department aren't really doing by themselves. But combined, maybe we'll have the solution.
Environmental problems are not going away. They're getting bigger and bigger. They are increasingly touching every sphere of our thought and action. And the environmental humanities will become crucial to navigating this world that's emerging.
Do we care about the future? Do you feel a responsibility towards something other than yourself or your own species? These are the questions that will, if we can understand the answers to those questions, we might be able to move people in a certain direction or have them move themselves in a certain direction. So I'm hoping that comes from environmental humanities, because this doesn't seem to be coming from anywhere else.
Thinking critically and thinking carefully is a really important step to take as we kind of launch this conservation movement, the fight against climate change is going to look like in our lifetimes, is really important to just think ethically, think critically, and that's something that honestly a lot of scientists are lacking. I think everyone should be well versed in the humanities, not even specifically what environmental humanities looks like, but just to be able to think critically about our own actions and decisions is going to be really important as scientists, and something that I think is growing in the field.
I consider environmental humanities to be essential to what we call environmental justice, which is all about including the stakeholders in the problem solving. In the broadest context, the environmental humanities provides access to people's emotional responses to things. And art and literature and other forms of creative media are really good at expressing emotions and expressing how people feel about things. And again, environmental problems are not just scientific or policy problems to be solved and discussed by experts. In order to really solve environmental problems, we need everyone involved. And that means communicating with ordinary people who live in certain places where environmental problems exist. And so in order for those people to feel included in the problem solving of environmental issues, they need to be able to articulate their beliefs and their feelings and their ideas so that they are part of the solution as well.
William and Mary is about to join the ranks of 26 other colleges and universities in the United States that have chosen to open the world of environmental humanities to its community, offering its students, and subsequently ecological thought at large, a multidisciplinary path forward that amplifies every voice and avenue in challenging the rapidly growing environmental problems of our time.